Welcome to the second annual International Cybersecurity Conference here at Georgetown University. My name is Catherine Lotriante, and I'm the director of the Institute for Law, Science, and Global Security here at Georgetown. As you all may know, the internet, as we know it, has evolved into a global system that is an essential element in our daily lives, global commerce and national security. From a remarkable technical achievement supporting a limited number of users originally, today it is a massive network. In the past 30 years, the internet has developed from a small university and defense-based network to a worldwide grid of over 2 billion users that influences every facet of modern life. Because so many of our daily operations are now conducted in cyberspace, they become a valuable target for daily attack by a variety of actors, ranging from modern-day criminals interested in pure financial gain to nation-states seeking to steal technology or potentially to cripple a nation's war-fighting capability or infrastructure. While this network of networks has led to incredible gains in efficiency and has been a driver of worldwide economic growth, it has also created a new domain for crime, espionage, and potentially more dangerous actions. Many have noted that these cyber threats represent one of the most seriously disruptive challenges to our national security since the onset of the nuclear age 60 years ago. U.S. senior policymakers, intelligence professionals, military leaders, and private sector stakeholders have all described the importance of cybersecurity. In every survey of enterprise CIOs, security is called out as the number one or number two concern for them. And in the tough economic climate over the past 3 years, security spending by private industry has grown on a relative basis, even though in many cases overall IT budgets have not. Other nations have also followed suit in recognizing the challenges they face in cybersecurity. We can discuss whether enough is being done or how to work better on international issues, but clearly cyber issues are being identified as among the most important ones challenging us today. Despite the efforts by many in the government and the private sector, cybersecurity has become an increasingly urgent problem. There continue to be multiple reports of cyber intrusions across both industry and government. While both types of intrusions are troubling, each type represents different concerns for the nation and requires different levels of response and involvement by the government and private sector. Both types of intrusions may be national-level incidences, calling for a serious coordinated response. But how we respond, who responds, and under what guidelines and legal authorities to date has not been worked out. Today, gathered here at the second annual Cybersecurity Conference at Georgetown, are the key leaders from government and the private sector that are and will be some of the decision makers involved in addressing the critical challenges we face as a community of nations when it comes to securing the internet and all aspects of what we hold dear that transverses that technical marvel. The internet has connected all nations for good or ill, and it is the community of nations that must come together to resolve these challenges. Since its establishment of Georgetown University in 1815, international peace through international understanding has always been the university's rule of conduct. It is how we teach and live as a family here, a university, and a community. In 1919, Father Walsh established the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown in recognition of the need to equip young men and women with the necessary knowledge and training to go into the world as our future businessmen and women and official government representatives to effectively solve the problems of tomorrow. The school was established on the heels of World War I and the horrible lessons that were learned in that war. At the inauguration of the School of Foreign Service, Father Walsh stated that the definitive lesson from World War I was the realization that the world constitutes one huge family whose interests are common and whose members are interdependent. In no sector is this more true than with cybersecurity and the network of networks that connect us all. Before Father Walsh passed away, he established the Institute for World Polity at Georgetown. After he passed away, we picked up where he left off and established the Institute for Law, Science, and Global Security, which took up some of the issues that Father Walsh felt so dearly about. In 2006, I set up the Cyber Project under the auspices of the Institute in order to more concertedly examine the challenges of cybersecurity for the international community. Today, I've tried to gather some of those members from the community of nations for this conference so we can continue the critical dialogue on the steps needed to move the entire international community to a place where the internet and life as we know it and wish it to be is secure for all. The prosperity and tranquility of nearly all of us has been and will, in even greater degree, continue to be bound up with the course of events beyond our own territorial frontiers. International peace and prosperity in the cyber domain will result from a satisfactory ordering of rights, obligations, and mutual conduct. We hear much about the rights attaching to nationhood, but we hear less about the obligations resulting from membership in the great family of nations. In cyberspace, much more work still remains to be done among nations, within nations, to establish those rights and obligations for cybersecurity. So let us be realists without ceasing to be idealists and learn something from the lessons of the past as we move forward to try to solve the problems of cybersecurity. Much has been successfully done, particularly in the way of arousing a popular consciousness of the problem, but much remains for the undisclosed future. I, for one, are far from being discouraged. But today, there is no time for nostalgia for the good old times when it was okay for the internet to be insecure. No trepidation in the face of new and untried situations. The times have changed, and it behooves us to change with them. What we must do is keep in mind the factors influencing foreign policy, national security, international economic prosperity, and international relations in the context of cybersecurity. Change those factors that we can for the better of all, and deal with those that we cannot change. And lastly, and most importantly, there is a job to be done, so let's get to it. And that's what I hope we continue this year as we started last year in doing. I'm excited about our joint keynote this morning. Bill Lynn and Jane Hall-Lute will give individual remarks and then come together to jointly take questions and answers from the audience. Our first speaker this morning is William J. Lynn. He is the chairman of the board of directors and chief executive officer of DRS Technologies, Inc. Prior to joining DRS, Mr. Lynn served as the 30th United States Deputy Secretary of Defense from 2006 until 2011, where he managed 3 million personnel and oversaw an annual budget of $700 billion. He also personally led the department's efforts in cybersecurity, space strategy, and energy policy. From 2002 to 2009, Mr. Lynn was Senior Vice President of Government Operations and Strategy at the Raytheon Company. Previously, he served as Undersecretary of Defense and as Director of Program Analysis and Evaluation in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Mr. Lynn also worked on the staff of Senator Ted Kennedy as his counsel for the Senate Armed Services Committee. It is my great honor to welcome Bill Lynn to the podium.
Thanks very much, Catherine, for that nice introduction, and thank you for putting together this terrific conference. It really does, as you said, bring together the private sector, the government, and academia, both U.S. and international. You have, I think, most of the thought leaders in the cybersecurity discussion, so I'm sure you're going to have a great day. And I see in the audience many of the people I spent the last couple of years with. Actually, in a room like this, it was smaller, but it had no windows and bad lighting. So it was a situation room. I see Sean Henry and Bob Butler, Chris Painter. And I'm particularly pleased to be sharing the stage with another veteran of those meetings, Jane Hall-Lute. She's done an extraordinary job as the deputy at Homeland Security, leading the agency through the thickets of cybersecurity, border control, and emergency response. People, I think, forget what a young agency DHS is. It's less than a decade old, and the challenges I just mentioned would be hard for any agency, but they're particularly difficult for one that you're building from the ground up. It's a little bit like finishing the airplane while you're in flight. So I would particularly want to recognize Jane's efforts, and I look forward to her remarks. I'd like to focus my remarks on the three major threats that I see facing the nation in cybersecurity. The threat to our technological competitiveness from the rampant and increasing theft of our most important intellectual property. The threat to our military superiority due to asymmetric challenges from potential adversaries' cyber capabilities. And the threat to our critical infrastructure from destructive attacks on our power grid, transportation network, financial sector, or telecommunications backbone. Now, these three threats are all linked together by overlapping technologies, but I want to separate them because I think they are going to take different legal and policy approaches to address each of them in turn. The first threat is the long-run threat to our competitiveness due to the loss of technology and intellectual property through cyber theft. It is important to understand that this isn't a new phenomenon. Nations have been stealing each other's technologies for centuries. Indeed, in the early industrial age, the United Kingdom complained about intellectual property theft by Germany and, yes, the United States. They argued accurately, in fact, that they were stealing their manufacturing secrets. In the nuclear age, the USSR stole the plans for the atomic weapons from us. But I would argue the issue has changed with the advent of cyber technology, which has increased both the volume of data that can be taken and the speed at which it can be transferred. It's no longer possible to expect the buffer of significant lags between the theft of technology and its introduction into service. As a consequence, I believe we must take the current generation of military and industrial transfer more seriously than those of the past. To address this threat, we need to employ more fully than we have to date all of the tools at our disposal: trade, diplomatic, and military. We need to seek a halt to this hemorrhaging of technology. In particular, as this conference is focused on, we need to establish international norms to create a stronger regime to fight what Mike McConnell has called the greatest and largest transfer of wealth in history. Second, the military dimension of cyber capabilities. Simply put, information technologies are changing the nature of conflict. IT has added a fifth domain of warfare that is as critical to military effectiveness as land, air, sea, and space. Warfare was first transformed by the industrial age, then by the atomic revolution, and it is now being shaped by the information age. Information technologies are now at the core of our most important military technologies. They give us the capability to communicate with certainty, to navigate with accuracy, to see the battlefield with clarity, and to strike with precision. The information age has without doubt increased the substantial comparative advantages the U.S. military already possessed. But the price for this increased capability has been to introduce new vulnerabilities. If adversaries can compromise our networks, they can rapidly degrade our capabilities. They can blind our satellites, they can jam our communications, they can foul our logistics, and they can make smart bombs dumb again. The opportunity for asymmetric advantage is not lost on other militaries, many of whom are developing world-class cyber capabilities. It's essential that we respond to this asymmetric threat to our military superiority. We must ensure that our military is able to act freely in the cyber environment. We must also be able to act in a degraded cyber environment. We cannot assume our protections will be perfect, but we nevertheless must ensure that our cyber networks have the highest protections possible. Finally, no defense is going to be perfect, so we must have offensive cyber capabilities that can at a minimum act as a deterrent to major nation states. The deterrent capability will be particularly important in protecting critical infrastructure from cyber attacks in potential conflicts with other nations. This crosses over to the final threat in the cyber arena: the potential for destructive attacks on our critical infrastructure. Over the past decade, we've seen an escalation in the harmfulness of cyber attacks. To date, the most prevalent cyber attacks have been exploitation of our networks. By that I mean the theft of data from both government and commercial networks. This kind of cyber exploitation does not have the dramatic impact of conventional military attacks. But as I noted earlier, these exploitive attacks have long-term impacts on our technological competitiveness that need to be addressed. But in the last few years, a second type of cyber threat has emerged: disruption of our networks, where intruders seek to deny or degrade the use of important government or commercial networks. The denial of service attacks against Estonia in 2007 and then Georgia in 2008 were early examples of this type of threat. More recently, in the commercial sector, we've seen denial of service attacks mounted against banks, other financial institutions, and some other commercial entities. But the third and most dangerous cyber threat is a destructive attack where cyber tools are used to cause actual physical damage. This development, which marks a strategic shift in the cyber threat, is only just emerging. But when you look at what tools are available, it is clear that this destructive cyber capability already exists. It could be used against our military networks, but more dangerously, it could be used to cripple critical infrastructure segments. Attacks against the transportation system, the financial network, or the energy sector could cause severe economic loss, physical damage, and even the loss of life. Of course, it's possible that we'll never see a destructive cyber attack. But regrettably, few weapons in the history of warfare, once developed, have gone unused. And what makes it especially likely that destructive cyber attacks will actually occur is the potential for their proliferation. It's the potential for the proliferation of the destructive tools. For as this cyber threat has moved up a ladder of escalation from exploitation to disruption to destruction, the groups that possess these capabilities have been expanding in dangerous directions. We are moving from a world where only sophisticated nation-states have destructive capabilities to the possibility that rogue states or even terrorist groups could develop or acquire these capabilities. We therefore stand at an important crossroads in the development of cyber threats. More destructive tools are being developed, but have not yet been used. And the most malicious actors have yet to acquire the most harmful capabilities. This situation will not hold forever. Terrorist groups or rogue states could and probably will obtain destructive cyber capabilities. We need to develop stronger defenses before we see this marriage of capability and intent. We, in short, have a window of opportunity of uncertain length to protect our networks against these more perilous threats. We can either adopt strong policies to prevent these types of disruptive attacks, or we can wait until they occur, and then we'll have to overhaul our policies as a response to such attacks. Let me conclude by outlining what I think we need to do with this window of opportunity, and then let me turn then to Jane for her comments. Defending our critical infrastructure will require more than perimeter defenses like firewalls and intrusion detection systems. We need to extend active defenses to critical infrastructure. Now, Bob Butler is going to talk more at lunch about what actually constitutes active defenses, but let me say by active defenses I mean defenses that use more sophisticated techniques to divert attacks, defenses that assume some level of penetration and allow us to hunt on our own networks, and most importantly, defenses that allow us to use our intelligence capabilities to anticipate and preempt the type and pattern of attacks. All of these elements of active defenses, especially the call for intelligence capabilities, require the government and private industry to partner in defense of our critical infrastructure. Since the challenge in cyberspace is much broader than a traditional military threat, the response must encompass both government and private entities. We need joint efforts to defend critical infrastructure. We need better information sharing on cyber threats as they materialize. And we need joint research to improve cybersecurity in the longer term by reducing the inherent advantages that attackers now enjoy on the internet. In short, I think it is possible to make progress on all of these lines, but I also think our time is short and the time to act is now. Thank you.
I'd like to now introduce Deputy Secretary Jane Hall-Lute, a graduate of Georgetown University's Law School. She has over 30 years of military and senior executive experience in the United States government. She currently serves as the second highest official and chief operating officer in the Department of Homeland Security. At DHS, she works to secure our nation while enhancing federal, state, and local capabilities to prepare for, respond to, and recover from threats and disasters of all kinds, including preventing terrorism, enhancing securing and managing our borders, enforcing and administrating our immigration laws, safeguarding and securing cyberspace, and strengthening national resilience through disaster and all-hazard preparedness, response, and recovery. Previously, Ms. Lute served as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, responsible for logistical and administrative support to UN peacekeeping operations worldwide, and as Assistant Secretary General for Peace Building, responsible for coordinating efforts to build sustainable peace in countries emerging from violent conflict. Ms. Lute also served on the National Security Council staff under both President George H.W. Bush and President William Jefferson Clinton, and had a distinguished career in the United States Army, including service in the Gulf during Operation Desert Storm. Deputy Secretary Lute, it is an honor to have you here today.
Catherine, thanks very much. And Bill, thanks so much for those very warm words. When the Obama administration began, one of the unusual things was about it was that all of the deputy secretaries of the departments, I don't know, 12 or 14 of them, of us, had already served together. And it was a great privilege and a great relief to be able to join the company of folks like Bill Lynn. Bill's right, we spent a lot of hours together in the Situation Room with many of you in this room. It was all wonderful hours. But particularly Bill, you're always wise, always thoughtful, and a wicked sense of humor, which I, for one, really appreciated. I'm going to build a little bit on what Bill was talking about, but before I do, and talk about cybersecurity specifically, I thought I would spend just a couple of minutes and talk about Homeland Security. It is a relatively new department, a department that's 9 years old. That's good news. It is not 1 year old for the 9th time. Some of us have been in organizations like that. But the Department of Homeland Security really is a department that has come into its own and has matured in many ways. And it's an extraordinary thing to say, but I think it is true that if we had to invent this department today, again, we could do it. And you can't always say that about organizations. And that's because I think the value proposition of the department has become clearer over the course of time, building on the experience of the past 9 years. And it struck me when I joined the department that while we had extraordinary brand name recognition, everybody's heard of the Department of Homeland Security, we had something less than extraordinary brand name understanding. What is it that the department does? People know Secret Service, they know the Coast Guard, they know TSA, Border Patrol, et cetera. But when we talk about Homeland Security, what do we think we're trying to do? What do we tell people that we're trying to do? And what we say is the following. In Homeland Security, what we're trying to do is help create a safe, secure, resilient place where the American way of life can thrive. Create a safe, secure, resilient place where the American way of life can thrive. Every word in that sentence is important. In order to do that, we think we need to do 5 things. We need to prevent another 9/11, prevent terrorism. We need to secure our borders. We need to enforce our immigration laws. We need to ensure our cyber security, and I'll spend time on that. And we need to build national resilience. And we need to do all of these things. But when you look at these things and you examine these missions and how we do them, you can see some of the duality that's inherent, maybe tension, some say, in the missions of Homeland Security. Let's take border security, for example. On the one hand, border security, we want to maintain the integrity and the confidence in our borders. We want to keep out people and goods that might be dangerous, but at the same time, we want to expedite legitimate trade and travel. At the same time, we want to expedite legitimate trade and travel. And so we have had to find ways, working with the department and the federal government, and indeed with all of the American people, in doing both, stopping things that might be dangerous, but helping to create a safe, secure, resilient place where our way of life can thrive. 3 years ago, when we wrote the QHSR, the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review, the first one ever, we called this mission out, creating the safe, secure, resilient place, and these 5 tasks or missions of Homeland Security that I mentioned: preventing terrorism, securing our borders, enforcing our immigration laws, building our cybersecurity, and building national resilience. And we called out cybersecurity and brought it up to a level of these other missions because we believed it was essential to the success of the American homeland. How should we think about cybersecurity? And there is an endless search for an analogy that works. Is it a marketplace? Is it a library? How should we think about cyberspace, that is? The way I think about it is as the endoskeleton of modern life. It's hard to imagine anything that we do in modern life, certainly in this country, that doesn't in some part depend on cyberspace. But one of the truths about operating in cyberspace was raised to me by Jeff Moss, a colleague whom many of you may know, the founder of DEF CON and Black Hat. He said, it's extraordinary that 25 years after the explosion, the beginnings of the explosion of the internet, 25 years later, there's not a single thing you can do in cyberspace confident that your information or your identity will not be compromised. You can't plug in your computer. You can't get on the internet. You can't stop, shop, visit, talk, or do anything confident that your identity and your information will not be exploited. Bill talked in detail about some of the threats at the upper end of the spectrum, but if any of you have been compromised, had your Facebook compromised, your Facebook page compromised, or suffered any other kind of cyber intrusion, then you know what I'm talking about. Even at the lower end. In fact, all throughout the spectrum of crime and mischief, leading up to the very upper end of espionage and other mischief, there's nothing that you can do in cyberspace confident that your information and your identity will not be compromised. So what's our theory of the case? If what Bill says is true about the threat, not only the potential threat, but the existing threat, what do we do about that threat? How should we understand it? And what should the government do? And here I'd like to talk about a misconception, a problem, and an opportunity. What's the misconception? The misconception is that the role of government in cybersecurity is clear to everyone who asks themselves that question. That's a misperception. It's not clear. In fact, this is really a present at the creation moment when it comes to cybersecurity and when it comes to understanding the role that government should play in cybersecurity. We have our views. It won't surprise you to learn. What's the problem? Well, the problem is, like many issues today, the views on this question are extremely polarized. On the one hand are those who believe that government should have nothing to do with cybersecurity, that it was the private sector, notwithstanding the deep origins of the internet that came out of DARPA and the Department of Defense, but really the explosion and expansion and the greatest opportunity that's presented in cyberspace, presented in our interactions on the internet, the greatest opportunities have come from the private sector, and we should rely only on the private sector, only on the market to resolve the problems and challenges that we face in cyberspace. On the other hand are those who believe that it's a war zone out there, and that the only way we can secure ourselves is by asserting a very heavy government hand, not only by this government, but by others, in securing and setting the rules for security in cyberspace. What's the opportunity? The opportunity exists now to resolve a way forward and craft a way forward that is both suitable to the problem that we have and pragmatic. So how do we begin? In the Department of Homeland Security, we begin by protecting.gov. What does that entail? We believe that protecting.gov is very much like what it would take to protect the rest of the internet and protect.com. It takes a layered system, and it takes the efforts of all. There's no single department that can do all that needs doing when it comes to cybersecurity, not even the Department of Homeland Security, the third largest federal department. Even if it works together with the Department of Defense, the largest federal department. Quiz, what's number 2? But no single department or combination of departments, no single government can do all that needs doing when it comes to the security of cyberspace. So what do we need? We need a system where that distributes the responsibilities of security, where we have smart users, where users would not only be people but also smart machines, and we've got to make it easier to introduce and access and use cybersecurity tools and systems. It's simply too difficult right now. It's too difficult for the individual user. It's too difficult for many institutionalized users as well. That simply cannot prevail. We need to make it easier to use cybersecurity tools. So we need a system where smart users, smart machines are supported by intelligent networks and augmented by an appropriate and proper role for government in this space. In other words, we need to build and manage a cyber ecosystem where we can ensure your security at the same time while we are securing your identity and your information and maintaining the values of privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties that we've all come to expect, and in fact, that we've all come to honor. As we think about this, though, what we know certainly is that the United States is not the be-all and end-all of the internet. It's a global institution, in fact. And we have views on how the internet should be managed in the global space. I know Chris Painter will be talking about this later. In our view, cyberspace needs to be open. It needs to be interoperable. It needs to be reliable. And yes, it does need to be secure. But above all, we want an open internet that is secure. We don't want a secure internet that is not open. And we understand the importance and the value complexity in this openness. My colleagues and I have just finished negotiating with the Europeans a big data exchange in the area of aviation security and data exchange, passenger name records, if any of you are familiar with it. And we spend a great deal of our time talking about privacy and the importance of privacy. And what we've learned over the course of these negotiations is that we and the Europeans have two very different views, two very different starting points when it comes to privacy. Now, I'm not an expert in European law, but it has been characterized to me, and I've come to know this to be true, that the European view of privacy is the ability of an individual to put information out there and control it in the full extensiveness of its existence wherever out there is. The American view of privacy is somewhat different. Ours begins from the understanding that we can restrict the intrusion that government is able to make into our lives. Equally legitimate views, but different starting points when you're trying to reconcile them in a practical operational regime of information sharing. What are some of the things that we've learned as a practical matter in trying to square that circle? We know we can architect systems that emphasize data minimization, purpose and use limitations, and that have very pragmatic, workable solutions for anonymization, masking of data, restricting access, and other controls that ensure the physical and actual security of people's information. So governments are playing a role here, and they're going to continue to play a role. Why? Because the status quo is unacceptable. It is dangerous out there in cyberspace. We're all victims, potentially, and we cannot any longer ignore the problems that we face. What can be done about it? Plenty. We can all begin by exercising basic cyber hygiene. I used to ask a question in audiences when I was spending a lot of time working on preventing violent conflict. People would say to me, "You can't prevent violent conflict. It's always been with us. It's been with us from time immemorial." And my response to that has been, war is not the weather, and we shouldn't act like it is. So some will view cybersecurity as an impossible problem, one that's been with us since the advent of the internet and one that will always be with us. It's not true. We can undertake basic preventive measures, as we do with our personal health, as we do with our automobiles and other complex machinery, to prevent bad things from happening. So we have a program called Stop, Think, Connect. It's simply designed to cause you to think more about what you're hooking up to, what you're opening in your emails, what sites you're visiting, and running routine software patches and cybersecurity updates. Cybersecurity at an individual level is a key part of any regime of cybersecurity. That must be done. So individual users need to be smart, they need to be switched on, and they need to be attuned to their responsibilities in this. We also know that it simply needs to be easier. Manufacturers need to be encouraged to ship equipment with the cybersecurity capabilities enabled and already switched on. And we need to have standards with respect to what that means we can expect when we buy a computer, we plug it in, and we access the internet. And governments, too, should play their part, and we will play our part. The Obama administration, both domestically and internationally, has been an active participant in the debates on cybersecurity, and we will continue to do this. And I'll close with just reflecting on this notion that it takes all of us to do our part. When I was a peacekeeper at the United Nations, I was struck about how civilians and soldiers would come together to keep the peace. Why? Because peace will not keep itself, as we know, and that the purpose of peacekeeping is to protect and strengthen fragile peace. But I found that you needed both the efforts of civilians and the efforts of soldiers and the efforts of militaries. You needed both the efforts of insiders and the efforts of outside governments to help protect and strengthen the fragile peace. Why was that the case? And what I realized was soldiers confront these problems and go to these places around the world expecting the worst humanity has to offer. And civilians confront these problems and go to these places believing in the best humanity has to offer. And we need both perspectives. And we will continue to work together with our partners in the federal government and certainly with our partners in the private sector, in whose hands so much of the critical infrastructure of this country lies, to ensure a safe, secure, resilient cyberspace where our way of life, indeed the way of life of humanity, can thrive. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Lute. As Bill joins us back on stage with Ms. Lute, I ask that the audience please stand, if you have a question, please stand behind the microphone. Give your name and organization when you are called, and please precisely ask one question so we can get to as many people as possible.
There are no questions. It's so tightly woven.
I'll ask one. Chris Fall, Office of Naval Research. I'm interested from the U.S. government perspective about the push towards cloud computing. Is that a good thing? What are the new security challenges? It seems like we could gain a lot of efficiencies, a lot of capabilities, but a little bit unknown there about the security implications.
Well, I think, like most things, it's mixed. It's certainly a good thing in terms of, I think we're going to be able to save quite a bit of money by taking hardware out from under the desks and putting it in the cloud. I think the individual security will be higher. You'll have fewer points of entry. You'll have fewer ways to get at the targets. The problem is there are then fewer targets, so you make them more lucrative. So particularly for high-end threats, I think you have to worry. I don't think you want to reverse it, and I don't think it makes it worse. But I think you have created a framework where incursions may do more damage in a cloud-enabled world than they might have been able to do in a more distributed world. So I think we have to move forward in this area, but I think we need to do it carefully.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the other thing is, we're all talking about clouds. I'm not sure we were 2 years ago. Brings up an interesting point that both the problems and the opportunities and the technology that we'll be dealing with even 2 or 3 years from now haven't been invented yet. So, just as Bill said, what will happen in the cloud? Certainly what will happen is we're moving in that direction, and people's reliance then on not only the cloud services that are offered, but connectivity to the cloud will increase, and we need to take account of that as this migration occurs.
Thank you. Jason Healy with the Atlantic Council. Since we're at an international conference, it's been very important for us to work with our traditional allies, for example, the Five Eyes, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But we also know in cyberspace that the emerging countries, for example, the G77s, or Japan, Korea, or China and Russia are important. How as leaders do you balance that between working with our traditional allies, with those people that are emerging? And a related question, how do you, when you approach cyber, you're both approaching it from a very national security perspective, and do you find that leads to clashes when you deal with more technical people? Thank you.
So a couple of quick points. I mean, you're talking to somebody who spent a good deal of time at the United Nations, as well as being a U.S. official. The United States has always, I think, taken a professionally enlightened view of the world and been very attentive, not only to our traditional partners, but to others around the world as well. In the Department of Homeland Security, in fact, one of the, I think, striking developments over the past half dozen years or so, the degree to which we have homeland-to-homeland dialogues now with a number of partners internationally. Some of our traditional allies, but also others like India, for example. While an important partner for the United States in so many respects, well, we've begun to explore new dimensions of our relationship through this homeland dialogue. And they're certainly important and importantly vocal on the whole question of the development of the internet and of cybersecurity and normative development there as well. And on the question of national security, as someone who spent most of their career in national security, I'm struck by the degree to which homeland security is different. National security is strategic, centralized, and top-driven, and homeland security is transactional, operational, decentralized, and bottom-driven. When I mean driven by the communities and the states and the municipalities in this country. It's a very different orientation on problem solving, but again, a very potent collaboration.
Let me just chime in as well. On the international issue, that's one of the reasons I tried to divide the problem the way I did. I think there's a class of issues that are security issues for the United States, and there, as you said, we naturally turn to our allies, starting with the Five Eyes, but moving on through NATO, and that's a natural progression. But there's also a set of issues, particularly having to do with the exploitation, the theft of intellectual property, which I think are broader issues and in which we can deal with a very wide array of allies, of potential allies, neutral countries, even potential adversaries, because I think it can be in everyone's interest to set up a regime. People have used the model of a public health regime. Others have used money laundering. But I mean, there are regimes where you don't have to agree with everyone, even on basic issues, to be able to make progress on things like international norms and a regime that makes the whole entity more secure. So I think we need to do both, and I think we need to make sure we understand which lane we're in as we talk to people. And then on the issue of national security, is cyber a national security issue? Obviously, from my remarks, I most definitely think it is, because I think cyber has become essentially the central nervous system of our economy. It is critical to whole aspects of what this nation does. That said, not all cyber issues are national security issues, and in fact, most are not. There's a whole series of issues that are law enforcement issues that I don't think the Department of Defense, the national security agencies have any business getting involved in. So I think, again, drawing a line and trying to decide, and I'm, to be precise, I'm saying I think the line extends to critical infrastructure in terms of national security, but at this point, not beyond. I mean, the security for individual, and Jane talked some about it, individual security, protecting your identity, I don't treat as a national security issue. It's a very important issue. It's a very important government issue, but it's more of a law enforcement, not a national security question.
Can I have a footnote to this? I think we really need to update ourselves when we talk about international. It is really no longer simply the province of nation states and of governments. I mean, when you think of the things that can claim active affinity and allegiance of 1 billion people or more on the planet, I can think of five or six things. You know, being an Indian, being Chinese, being Catholic, being Muslim, or being on Facebook. Now that's extraordinary. What does it mean to talk about international anymore?
So I was struck by a recent report, I think, but from Trend Micro, Stuart Baker, which actually identified with a considerable precision a hacker from China that they thought was behind a number of attacks recently against U.S. corporations associated with Tencent, the big instant messaging company in China, and with Sichuan University. This is an opportunity for the United States, if we're taking this seriously, to demand answers from these institutions about what they know about the activities of this individual, what their roles were in his activities, and to come up with punishments if the answers aren't satisfactory. What is the Department of Homeland Security, which controls visas for these folks to the United States and other possible punishments, doing to investigate the Trend Micro report?
So, Stuart, I'm not going to comment on any particular ongoing investigation. It may surprise you to hear. But as Bill mentioned, and you'll hear, I think, later from Sean, on the whole law enforcement front with respect to cybersecurity, we have certainly the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and we also have the Secret Service that's very active in cybersecurity forensic analysis generally. In fact, we have almost 400 certified cyber forensic specialists in the Department of Homeland Security alone. And so this is something, again, that we're very active on in a number of fronts with active investigations, but here, too, not operating alone, working together with our other law enforcement partners in the federal government, at the state and local level, and internationally. But on the specifics of an individual case, I really don't have much to say.
Yeah, so this raises the question, though, whether we can find ways to incentivize institutions who may be associated with this or may only know something about it to cooperate with U.S. investigators, something that otherwise, you know, a U.S. subpoena isn't going to carry very far in China.
No, I mean, we believe very strongly, in exercising the full extent of law enforcement capabilities in dealing with the cybersecurity problem, and that extends to our diplomatic and other dialogues as well.
Thanks.
Hi, Ashton Perry with Renesas. I've heard tell from some people who should be in the know that Australia and the Netherlands have shown leadership in cybersecurity. And I was wondering if you could comment on the nature of that kind of leadership and what impact it may have on how we think about U.S. policy and/or cybersecurity in our country.
Again, certainly from my perspective, you're going to have opportunities to talk about this later. There are a number of countries, actually, that are seized with the importance of dealing with the cybersecurity problem. I mean, it's not a particularly great insight to say the status quo is unacceptable. We all have different systems, however, and each of the governments are approaching the problem in slightly different ways, but I think it's fair to say with a joint commitment to figure out the problem of how to appropriately engage, recognizing that in many places in Europe and Australia as well, key and critical infrastructure to the functioning of those economies and those societies lies in private hands. So this is not going to be a problem that governments are going to be able to solve on their own. There has to be a deeply intertwined connectivity to the private sector with, I think, a high degree of information sharing. One of the differences that, again, as someone who spent their whole career in national security, it's, you know, there's a culture, understandably, of, you know, keeping information confidential, secret even, you know, and sharing only on the basis of need to know. In Homeland Security, there is a presumption of transparency and a duty to share. Again, we can combine those things, not only nationally, but internationally as well with our partners. But I repeat myself and apologize for saying this is very much a present at the creation moment.
Just, I mean, I think the reports are accurate. Australia has taken, I think, some leadership, both in terms of technologies as well as maybe more importantly, policy approaches. They have, I think, as coherent a national policy. It doesn't mean it's gone unchallenged, but I think they have a national policy on cybersecurity that, while not perfect, suggests that things can be done at that level. So I think we can learn. And then, as Jane alluded, you know, or someone else alluded, our natural security partners in NATO, the Netherlands, and I particularly look at the United Kingdom, have also, I think, taken steps that where we can learn and collaborate to our benefit. Very unsettling when somebody puts up a sign that says "end."
I'd like to thank you both for your time this morning and for joining us. And I think that the best way, to follow this discussion would be to have a cybersecurity address from Howard Schmidt, the cybersecurity coordinator for the White House. Quickly, I'd like to introduce him. First to you all, it's a great honor that he's taken the time out of his very busy schedule to come and join us on this important topic. Mr. Schmidt's distinguished career spans more than 40 years in defense, law enforcement, and corporate security. His private sector executive roles cover companies such as Information Security Forum, eBay, and Microsoft, while his government service includes assignments at the White House, the FBI, and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. His military career includes active duty tours with the U.S. Air Force, service in the Arizona Air National Guard as a computer communications specialist, and in the U.S. Army Reserves as a special agent, Criminal Investigation Division, where until his retirement from the reserves, he served with the Computer Crime Investigations Unit. In short, there is nothing he cannot do. Howard, it's a pleasure to have you with us this morning.
Well, good morning, and thanks very much for that kind introduction. And I'm glad to see everybody here this morning. Was worried about myself. Traffic was typical in D.C. this morning, trying to get from the White House over to here. And tell you what, you talk about our military, the Army person that was riding over here did a wonderful job weaving through traffic and didn't even have to use a tank this time, which was nice. Anyway, my appreciation for Bill and Lynn for their comments. I wish I was able to get here through all of them, but clearly you two have not only led this for a number of years on the government side. I know, Bill, you continue to do that, but I think on a very personal basis, you made my life so much easier. Part of the job, I think, when the president established my office was to, coordinate across government, and that's always a struggle because you have individual perspectives from different departments and agencies. You have different levels of expertise. You have different levels of understanding in this area. And clearly what you and Jane did and continue to do in different roles now really made that workable. So thank you, and it's good to see you again. One of the things that I think is very important to emphasize is some of the things that the president said about this particular issue. And I quote, "Every American depends, either directly or indirectly, on our system of information networks. They're increasingly the backbone of our economy and our infrastructure, our national security, and our personal well-being." And that's why an event like this is so vitally important, because it ties all these pieces together. When you start looking at, and I'll just touch on the economic piece for a moment, while there's a lot of numbers that are thrown out there about the losses in economic perspective, the loss of intellectual property, the cost to implement systems in cybersecurity to be more robust, more resilient, there are some numbers that we have some pretty good data around. And one of them I find probably the most compelling, that over $8 trillion are exchanged over the wired and wireless networks each year, and it's growing. And effectively, if you look at the ability to disrupt that activity on the internet at any time, it has a dramatic impact on our economy. So with that in mind, when the president established this office, as Jane had mentioned, her long career in national security, clearly it was recognized that this is not just a national security issue. It's national security, public safety, as well as economic, and that's why I'm dual-hatted to both the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. But when we start looking at where we've come, and I'll take just a couple minutes to talk about that, I think what we need to do is not always look in the rearview mirror and see where we've been, but see where we need to go. And I think clearly that's the piece that we work on the hardest, are what are the things that we need to do, not only from creating strategies, because we've done a really good job in working across agencies, FBI, DHS, DOD, Department of Energy, Department of Treasury, really coming together with some great strategies on some of the things we need to do about trusted identities. Again, I'll speak about that in a few moments. On the international basis, adding state to that mix of great departments and agencies looking at this. But as both Bill and Lynn commented on, the private sector has a critical role, if not a leadership role, in many of the things that we're doing. So when we look at this and we look across all these different strategies, the intent is to implement national and international cybersecurity policies to reduce our threats to the vulnerabilities that exist in our networks today, and make sure that none of us are impacted negatively by any of the threats that are out there against us. So when you look at the way, sort of the state of cybersecurity today, one of the key things we recognize is there are no shortage of bad threat actors out there. And we can put them in different buckets, and oftentimes we do. One of the things we need to be very cautious of as a society is not to conflate all these different groups into some massive action across our international systems as well as our domestic systems. So clearly, if we break it down into areas around cyber criminals, where we're in a situation where we've seen this for 20 some odd years. I remember my first cyber crime case was what we call it now in the days, we called it computer crime, was in 1986. And that was with the advent of many of the things we see today around telecommunications fraud. And it's evolved since that time. But we also look at the area when we look at nation-state activities. And there's enough of that activity to make sure that we have to guard against that. We have to make sure their systems are better protected, but we also have to send a clear message that this is unacceptable behavior. And I know later on this morning there'll be another panel talking more broadly about that. But there's another piece of it that I think probably gets the biggest amount of activity, and the activity that basically we have not moved forward fast enough, and that's around the theft of intellectual property. And this is really challenging because the vast majority of the IP we're looking at is in the hands of private sector. And when we talk with private sector, there's different perspectives about what to do about it. Some say, and in many cases not inaccurately so, gee, yes, we don't like it, we've been intruded upon. Yes, we don't like it that someone's had unauthorized access to our network. We don't like the idea that someone's stolen our intellectual property, but we can outrun them. Because by the time they figure out what to do with it next, we'll be on to our next product. We'll be on our next set of standards, our next piece of software developing. And while that may be the case today, I'm not sure that's always going to be the case. Matter of fact, I doubt it will be the case. Because what we're doing is then giving other entities the keys to the kingdom. And as we all know, the internet, as we've developed it, society has evolved. Many of the benefits we have were directly related to the technology that's been developed. There's another set of perspectives that believe that, yeah, they're taking it, they're going to at some point develop against us, but there's nothing we can do about it. And that's also inaccurate. There's a lot we can do about it. If we look at the statistics that have been given to us by the FBI, by the Department of Defense, NSA, look at the information given to us by DHS, US CERT, about 80 to 85% of the successful things that we see going on networks today, both in and outside of government, are basically things that could have and should have been fixed. The term has been coined oftentimes using good cyber hygiene. And if we go back, as we oftentimes do, go back and look for the root cause of why some of these things happen, it's the same thing that we've been seeing for the past 20 some odd years. And for those of us that have been doing it for that long and have had an operational responsibility and see the same vulnerabilities that existed more than 20 years ago that exist today, the recognition of those, the exploitation of those, the fail to patch some of the systems, because there's a business imperative. It takes too much trouble. It's too slow. It may break some of our applications. But I can guarantee you, talk to the people that investigate these sort of things, and when they talk about the cost of recovering from that, it's much higher than fixing it from the very outset. So yeah, we believe it's always difficult when you have to shut down a system for a multiple number of hours through the course of a business day or a weekend. But to better protect yourself, that's the better way to go. And sort of the third piece of it, in those that are truly, truly, truly concerned about it, and say, yes, this is a tremendously difficult problem to solve. We are bleeding like crazy. We need the government's help. We need an all-of-government approach to this. We need to work with our private sector partners. We need to make sure that we have the ability not only to share information amongst, between the government and amongst the government agencies, but also amongst the private sector. I think a number of you in this room recognize that when we put forth the proposed legislation just about a year ago now, one of the things that we addressed in that was the ability to share information at all levels. And while we share that, to make sure we have tremendous controls in place to protect privacy and civil liberties. And we can do both. I remember conversations over the years, people say, well, what's more important, privacy or security? And the answer is both. And we can do both. For number one, when it comes to protection of data, without security, you have no privacy. That's one of the things that we've seen over the years with the number of databases that have been intruded upon, the amount of personally identifiable information that's been exploited and exfiltrated. Those could have been prevented, once again, with better security controls. And there's another piece of the privacy dimension, and that's basically when it comes down to what information that we're giving up to get goods and services. That's an issue that we're looking at through the NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. We're looking at this on the bigger privacy issues that we deal with, but that's only a part of it. The other piece that we're looking at in the legislation we proposed that says, well, if information sharing was enough, that's all we would have asked for. But there's other components. There's got to be a clear message from a cybercrime perspective that hold people accountable to a higher level when they interfere with critical infrastructure. There's got to be a higher level when it comes to organized crime. Those are two specific areas that we're looking at. Another component of this is the area when it comes to government systems, making sure that we have defined, codified processes in place to make sure that we're doing what we can to protect USG systems. Now, I recognize some of the faces in the audience, so I know those of you in the audience might have either heard this before or said it yourselves, but we have to move from an environment where to be FISMA compliant, you can still be insecure. We want to flip that around. By becoming secure, you indeed become FISMA compliant. And that's what we're working now with continuous monitoring, trusted internet connections, the ability to make sure we're doing strong authentication, not only the humans to the machines, but machines to machines. And have a mechanism to do this on a basis where we can look at it in any given moment and find out where we are and fix these things. The ability to be competitive in hiring is another piece that we're looking at. And probably the one that we get the most discussion about and seems to be the most controversial is how do we make sure that the core critical infrastructure, those owners and operators of that, have an ability to prove to the government and to the consumers and to the businesses that they are doing all they can do to make sure that their systems are secure. So the core critical infrastructure that we depend on is being designed and maintained to the best international standards that exist today in cybersecurity. And one would think that would not be that big of an ask. Because I think all of us, when we contract with somebody, when we look for services, we don't go out and look to buy an automobile that says, yeah, I might or may not decide to add brakes. I might or might not decide to have tires in there that aren't bald. These are things that we expect for safety and security. We have to do the same thing when it comes to the core critical infrastructure. And while I hear a lot of discussions about this being a federal issue, it's not a federal issue. Because every one of us in this room has a community that we go back to, whether it's locally or someplace else, that we live in a state or a district. We have a governor who is oftentimes looks the first level of response going out there. We have a mayor. We have a city manager. So when we look at the failure that could exist in our critical infrastructure, yeah, the feds, we will be there. But who's going to be the first responders? How many budgets and how many local, state and local governments can afford to have the first responder paying double time and triple time to deal with something that conceivably we could have prevented? And let me flip a little bit to the economic side of this. And both of my background in private sector and being a part of a venture capitalist businesses, and to seeing small and medium-sized businesses, the backbone of much of the innovation we see, what about them? We have natural things that take place that affect their businesses. Snowstorms, hurricanes, ice storms, windstorms, you name it. They're out of business for reasons that we can't control. But can they afford to be out of business for any period of time in today's economy because the core critical infrastructure was not available to them? Yes, we care about it for the military. Yes, we care about it for government operations on the federal side. But where's the impact really lie if we don't have core critical infrastructure level brought up as far as the resilience and its availability to be there? It's not just the federal government. It's the state and local governments and the small, medium-sized businesses that we have to protect. Some people talk about the proposed legislation specifically and talk about the impact on businesses. Let's look underneath that top layer. Let's look at all the businesses that will be affected if these things aren't better protected. And when you look at that $8 trillion figure, figure out what your local businesses, your local governments, what piece of that would be affected that hit them directly. So I want to then move on and just take a couple of moments to talk about the cybersecurity international strategy. When we talk about the expectations, once again, anybody that's been doing this for a while fully recognizes we will never be 100% secure. But internationally, we also recognize that no two countries are going to agree on 100% of the issues affecting national security. So what we're looking to do is build a partnership for our international partners to make sure it's secure enough to earn people's trust and reliable enough to secure their work. But in many cases, this is a road we've already gone down this path. Many of the rules of the road that we talk about currently exist, and I'll give you some examples. The UN Charter, the Law of Armed Conflict, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Budapest Cybercrime Convention. A lot of these things already exist, and they do apply when we start talking about cyberspace. While some believe that's not the case, when you look at the legal aspects of this, clearly they apply. And when we talk internationally, and I'll give you the classic example, which we hear an awful lot about, and that's the Law of Armed Conflict. That's a universal agreement. It applies in cyberspace like any place else. So we need to make sure that we apply that across the board. So when we start looking at sort of the next level down, when we start saying, how do we do this internationally? We need to make sure that we're working on a bilateral and multilateral basis around the world. And this doesn't mean to say, gee, we're not going to talk to these people because we don't like what they're doing in other cases. In cyberspace, we have to have those discussions. We're in the process of fostering them. We're making sure that all parts of the U.S. government are indeed engaged in this as an all-government approach. The number of bilats that we've had in the past, as we sit at the table with our counterparts from other countries, there's representatives from all the different pieces of the U.S. government, from the civilian side of government to the military and defense side of government, the intelligence community to the law enforcement community. We sit around the table together because none of us can solve this problem ourselves, nor do we believe our international partners that we're looking to engage and work with can do it on their own as well. And no surprise, some of those countries that we're working very closely with in this area, this was new for them as well. Because when we talk about, and we've done it in the U.S. government as long as I can remember back to my early days in the military, we talk about the stovepipes in the U.S. government. This is one topic where the stovepipes not only are disappearing, but need to continue to disappear. So other governments look at that and say, well, yeah, we only have people working on this. Why would they be a part of this? And when we sit down across the table with them, they truly understand how we have an all-government approach on this, that it's a coordinated approach. that we bring the expertise of every part of the government to bear on these very, very challenging problems to make sure that we're moving forward. And some of the domestic things that we look at that have international reach as well. For example, our power grid. When we start looking at what we are seeing in this country that's going to save us energy, save us money, do a better job of managing the natural resources we have, but clearly there's security implications that we need to take a look at. And so the Office of Science, Technology, Policy and my office work together to the cybersecurity components of the smart grid. We start looking at the e-health initiative, or the health information exchange. Clearly, that's something else that we need to work for as citizens. We need to not only bring that level up as far as what the technology can give us, but how we can protect that technology as well. And with that, it ties in all the other pieces that are working together. And my last sort of pitch, if you would, is to take a moment and talk about the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, or the NSTIC. When you look at the things that I've discussed today, both domestically and internationally, a lot of these things boil down to the digital identities that we have online. But to the extent that we need digital identities in some aspects, we need to also make sure we're preserving the anonymity that takes place out there. And many of us talk repeatedly about what happened during the Arab Spring. Much of that was only possible because of the ability to do some of the things anonymously on the internet, because otherwise repressive regimes would have stopped it right in the very beginning. But we also want to make sure at that end of the spectrum we preserve the anonymity, we preserve the ability to have freedom of expression without fear of being beaten down on it. But we also need to make sure that we have identity management in place for our transactions that we depend on, whether it's government services, whether it's banking and finance, whether it's travel, whether it's entertainment online. So what we're looking to build is an identity ecosystem, which we've asked private sector to take the lead on. We were able to secure about $20 million in grants run through the Department of Commerce. A really great leader over there by the name of Jeremy Grant came into government with a great level of experience in digital identities and sharing that across the government. But we're looking to private sector to help build that. So we're looking to draw not only on the current marketplace of identity providers, but also making sure that we as a government are the customers of those. So if not familiar, there was recently a memo that we put out that sent out to all the departments and agencies and said, move away from having your own password schemas. Move away from an environment where you have to provide tech support to people that forget their password. And by the way, I'm one of them. There was a recent national lottery for, I think it was the holiday tree lighting ceremony, which I had not logged into since last year. And one of the first things they ask you to do is log into your account. And the first thing you say is, I don't remember my password. I did that once a year ago. So the memo went out that says, let's start accepting third-party credentials. OpenID, Google ID, and the list is growing, working with GSA to have approved identity providers. It reduces our costs, and it normalizes the identity infrastructure, the ecosystem out there that we're working with. But there's big components to this we need to make sure we're working on. We have to make sure we're working on the technical standards. We make sure we have a component that builds privacy protections into this. And lastly, we have to have a governance component of this. That's vitally important to make sure that we're building a system that 5 years from now we're looking back and finding there's holes in it and saying, well, gee, why didn't we think about that? Or what happened to this company that built a really good system that was acquired by another company or had some other sort of an exit? How do we make sure that we can preserve and do the things that we're saying when it comes to those digital identities in cyberspace? And coupled with that is the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. Educating K through 12, making sure that we have awareness programs like the one the Department of Homeland Security runs in concert with the FTC and a number of departments and agencies, making sure that the tools are in place so end users can do a better job of protecting themselves. Because I hear people say all the time in the meetings that we have at the White House about, yeah, the private sector, if they only knew. And while they don't need to know all the difficult details, they're welcome to, but that's not what people are about. That's not their core competency. But what they do have to understand, or what tools are available to them to enjoy the rich and robust capabilities that the technology gives us and minimize the risk that bad things could happen to them. Because oftentimes when I do run into victims, and when I have in the past, they say, oh, I didn't know that was a problem. I didn't know someone could do this. And so we want to make sure that they're educated on what's out there and what risks are out there. Not to dissuade them from using the technology, but to help them use it smarter. But we also need to make sure we're doing the workforce development, both for private sector and for the government, to make sure when we hire a security professional that indeed we understand what we're getting. Because right now we have different programs across different parts of the world that security professionals mean different things to different people. So to harmonize and normalize that. So with that, I want to just conclude before I take some questions and sort of talk about what the President's asked us to do on this. He's asked us to bring together government, industry, and academia to look for the best ways to guard the infrastructure that supports our nation. We've done that. We continue to do that. This forum today is another extension of that, with all the right people getting together. We have an opportunity here in this room alone to have some of the country's leading thinkers, policymakers, and experts in international affairs come together to shape our future. While we still have to live in a world of legacy technology out there in some cases, we have to better protect that system, but we can't lose sight of what we're going to build for the future. Because I know from an operational perspective, we have spent a lot of energy protecting what we've got and maybe not being as focused on moving forward. So we need to make sure we're building the capacity to identify, isolate, respond to any cyber threat from no matter what sector it comes from, that we're implementing these new cybersecurity standards that protects our most important infrastructure, from the grids to the water systems, the transportation systems, home computer systems, and the international markets. President Obama said this is the task that lies before us. What we never let down our guard, nor should we ever suffer another failure of imagination. And believe me, when it comes to protecting cyberspace, there's a lot of people that are thinking on the backside of this, the negative side of this, that we need to make sure we're countering that. So the roles that we have, everybody has a role. We need to work together, academia, private sector, government, state and local and tribal governments, international partners, innovators, long-standing companies, but we need to make sure that we're working as hard as we can as a collective to make these things work. And yeah, that is a shot at one of the science fiction movies when we talk about the collective. So in closing, what I like to do is say what I say anytime I have an opportunity to meet with people, and that's, while we can't solve all these at one time, what we can do is each of us can do our part to secure our part of cyberspace, which makes us all more secure. So thank you very much for the opportunity to make these comments this morning. Thank you. I do. Thank you.
Questions and answers. To remind everybody in the audience, if you have questions, come to the microphone, name and organization, and please keep it to one question and not statements.
Question?
Yes, please.
Andy Ogielski, Renaissance. Various hierarchical resource public key infrastructures that are being proposed to secure cyberspace and various infrastructure components have very poorly understood vulnerabilities to revocation of authority by third parties. And therefore, businesses that participate in such schemes lose autonomy of decision who is secure and who is not. What efforts are you devoting to understand better the risks carried by public infrastructures for resource certification?
And when you talk about the revocation, you talk about certificate revocation? I'm
Yes.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, third party can essentially
Right.
execute a total denial of service against you.
Yeah, obviously, with what we've seen over the past, and quite honestly, past 15 years, where we've seen certificates issued through fraudulent means, one of the things I think we find out most often is, while we can identify it, there are not full implementation of revocation processes. We need to do a better job about making sure that they're set in place, that the technology automatically updates it, as we look at some of the things within the federal government for our certificate authorities, to make sure we're not 6 months down the road wondering if we actually got to do the revocation. There's clear standards. The certificate policy statements, the CPS that's been around for years, talks about the revocation process, and it's a matter of, like so many of the other things on a good hygiene perspective, we know what to do, we just need to implement it and make sure we're moving forward on it. Going back to the certificate authority issuers themselves, we need to make sure that they're being held to a higher standard. We depend on those certificates. We depend on their authenticity. And if we can't rely on them, that begins the castle crumbling, if you would, on our ability to depend on those things. So that's part of the discussion. It's part of the development, but it's an implementation more so than developing new policies. Thank you.
Hi there. Eli Jellens, work with VeriSign. I wanted to ask about the notion of public-private cooperation. That's something that's come up with your two predecessors here and yourself several times. Indeed, it's across, I don't know, a good 25 or 30 different countries, cybersecurity strategies or policies, sort of one of the primary articles of faith at this point, if you will. And of course, it is essential to bringing about outcomes. But what does that look like for companies that are operating, in dozens of countries, all and are required, in some cases, under enormous levels of coercion to cooperate with many different governments, not all of whom are friendly with one another? That can be bad enough, just across two, but when you scale that up across hundreds of companies, across dozens of governments, to what does that add up?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and a number of the discussion we've had with international partners in the past couple of years have been specifically around that. Multinational companies should not be in a position where they have to sort of maneuver in different waters because of political environments between government to governments. So there's two pieces that I think are important. Is one, we of those that do the government to government interactions make sure that we're not basically levying additional work on our international partners that run, operate, and develop the critical infrastructure. So no one asking them to do the same thing 15 different ways across different countries. Better coordination across that area. The other piece goes into the norms of cyberspace, and I know there's going to be some discussion later on about that. What are the rules of operations by which governments can provide working with the private sector partners? You've laid out some really interesting things, because when we start looking internationally, the relationship that the U.S. has had with private sector over our history is much different than many other countries. As a matter of fact, I've been in some environments where we talk about from a law enforcement perspective and requesting law enforcement information, and we say it doesn't fit in the Constitution. And they'll say, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. We don't have a Constitution. It doesn't apply to us. But the answer is, yes, it does. And that's some of the things that we've got to work towards through this international cooperation, is how do we get to those norms that everybody benefits, and not that everybody has to build a business process that's, 100 different countries have 100 different set of rules. It continues to be a challenge, and we need to hear not only from the companies on the challenge that they're seeing, but the companies themselves have to also make sure they're communicating with the countries that are more challenging to difficult to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I only have time for one more, if you would. Sorry.
Brett Berlin, Dynamics Research Corporation and George Mason University. It's good to see you again, Howard. There was a comment earlier that we need to rethink, for example, what international is. And what I'm wondering is, you mentioned workforce, and workforce is a key challenge everywhere. But perhaps what I'd like to get your comment on is, I think we may need to rethink and reset the whole way we view this problem. We've taken a view for a long time that this is a technology system into which people are embedded. It's actually a people system into which technology is embedded. And therefore, shouldn't we be looking to rethink the way we define workforce for the problem. And this is a basic set of communication and leadership, and we need to be bringing together people from all, for example, the Foreign Service School, everyone, and they need to understand the cyber situation and the technology as a basic insertion into the way we do human things and policy. If we rethink that, then we'll look other places for the workforce.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and that's why, as part of NICE, one of the first things we did across the United States government is the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, did a survey of about 50,000 employees to say, what does it mean in your environment? What are the skill sets we need to be cybersecurity persons? And you're absolutely correct. We've seen a convergence over the years where there were those of us that came in the sort of the vertical of, back in the day we called it information security, but we moved up that stack, and then we wound up having a whole set of other technologies that we were going back and trying to secure those. And what we're seeing is a good IT professional now not only has the specifics about router configuration or database administration or desktop configurations, but also how to do that securely. And so as we look at, at all things like the Colloquium for Information Systems Security Education across the 120 sub-odd universities, they're a part of the Centers of Academic Excellence, look across internationally and build those standards. So indeed we're doing as you're saying. Make sure that we're looking at it in the future sense, not what it used to be years ago. Thank you very much. Thank you.